Low hatchability is a widespread industry problem. Customers are constantly looking for ways to improve their fertility and hatchability. Changing the genetics is very impactful on fertility. There are many hatcheries in the United States that are just very old.
Welcome to Unplucked, the official podcast of the Poultry Science Association. This is the podcast where we strip away the fluff and get real about poultry science from bench to barn. I'm your host, Andy Vance, Executive Director of the Poultry Science Association. According to reports over the last decade, broiler hatchability rates in the United States have declined by 6 percentage points. That's our topic in this week's episode. The financial loss from that hatchability issue is enough to make poultry producers none too happy, but the industry's also had to face recurring outbreaks of highly pathogenic avian influenza, along with other disease challenges that have hindered flock health and further damaged economic gains for poultry producers. Joining us this week is Doug Ward, the Poultry Senior Sales Manager at Novus International, who will join us to talk about the situation with regard to hatchability and these other challenges related to profitability of production. We're going to hear his suggestions on what producers can do to get more from their flock. Doug, looking at all the things you're doing, and I also want to highlight the fact that you're a certified PACO animal welfare auditor, which we have a ton of respect for. PACO has been a great partner organization with PSA. I want to dig into you as somebody who's in the field dealing with customers on a day-to-day basis, starting with our friends in the broiler breeder sector. What are you seeing there on this issue of hatchability, and what are you hearing from customers about this problem on their farms and how it's presenting some real challenges for the industry?
Well, Andy, thank you for the very nice introduction. And low hatchability is a widespread industry problem. Like most issues, it is multifaceted. Customers are constantly looking for ways to improve their fertility and hatchability. And looking in, my observations are, again, it's a multifaceted issue. And we need to understand that I think there's two major distinct issues in what's going on in the industry. Changing the genetics is real and very impactful on fertility. And then secondly, there are many hatcheries in the United States that are just very old. There are some hatcheries in this area that are still operating that my grandparents got chicks from, and they quit growing chickens in 1972. So sometimes the industry doesn't always keep up with the technology, and some of the things that are perceived fertility may not be fertility. We don't often have the ability to incubate properly. So I just kind of want to make that distinction. I think that everyone is looking at fertility issues as hard as they can. They're looking at nutritional components, they're looking at management components, and they're looking at genetic components.
That's a good reminder that this is a complex issue. It's not a let's just flip this one switch or move this one lever and voila, we've solved it. So let's start to peel apart some of those. You mentioned genetics. Maybe that's a good place for us to get grounded. Are you seeing differences among genetic lines? Do you see some lines that do better with regard to hatchability than others? Or is that a good place for us to start understanding the nature of the beast?
When I think about that, I think about agristats and looking at agristats, and I'm not aware that there's any significant difference in hatchability between the genetic lines in the U.S. I think some customers think that maybe they are, but again, it's such a complex, multifaceted issue. I think it's very hard to tease out just genetics. In general, throughout the industry, hatch rates are low. And I think if we saw it in one genetic package versus the other, there would be a lot of discussion about that.
One of the things we had PSA President Doug Corver on the podcast recently talking about some of the work he's done with genetic companies. The thing I find interesting is, how rapidly the genetic companies respond to industry needs and concerns. So I think you make a good point there that part of our community is pretty responsive, and maybe we ought to look at some of the other pieces of this hatchability puzzle. So when you talk with your colleagues or companies around the world outside the U.S., are they seeing the same hatchability concerns, or is this something that is more specific to us in North America?
From the input that I've received recently, it seems to be more specific to North America. Certainly, there are places of the world that have issues, but now bear in mind, other places in the world, the genetic package is going to be different because the end customer requirements are somewhat different. I haven't been out of the U.S. in a hatchery since COVID times, I guess now, and it was a problem in other countries at that time. I think that maybe there's more pressure on breeders in the US, and I know pressure is a very broad term, but it seems like this industry, it's grown so fast that sometimes we can outgrow the good part.
Thinking about where we focus our attention, we put a lot of pressure on the hen side of the equation when it comes to hatchability, and maybe that's logical, but I'm wondering, what do we know about the male side of that equation? Is this potentially a male breeder issue? Do we have any indication that we need to look at one versus the other?
Oh, absolutely. The males, they're really stressed. There's a lot of pressure to keep those birds as lean as possible. Genetically, those birds want to just explode in growth. So, feeding programs, nutrition programs, we have to keep them in shape to be able to mate. So, that stresses the bird. We look at disease challenges. Sometimes the males are more subject to disease challenge. Litter quality sometimes can affect the males more than the females, specifically foot pad issues. And if we get foot pad issues, that bird doesn't feel good. So, mating becomes an issue. Nutrition affects so many things. Again, the skin quality for foot pads, it can affect the semen quality, which is a big thing. And I see more and more people looking at that aspect. Many years ago, a lot of companies, and I think some university studies were around sperm quality and fertility, high rates to fertility. So it is very multifaceted. It can be the male's health and behavior. If the bird doesn't feel good, it doesn't behave like a chicken, basically.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I would be remiss if I didn't encourage listeners to go back earlier this summer. Had a chance to talk with your colleague, Dr. Mercedes Vasquez-Anon, at the Poultry Science Association annual meeting. And we talked about some of those specific issues with regard to male health and fertility issues in a previous episode of the podcast. I would encourage folks to go back to the Unplucked page and listen to that interview with Mercedes. You mentioned when we were first kind of highlighting all of the different factors that play into hatchability management. So I want to think about that for a moment. Let's talk about housing situation, environment in the house. Is there something in terms of how we build and manage the barns that you see that can either hurt or help those broiler breeders?
Absolutely. I think recently there is more emphasis on actually ventilating breeder houses. In the past, not a lot of thought was given to that. But to give you kind of an example about how successful some people are with this, I had a local customer mention that his best service techs in the breeder house were ones who were once broiler techs because they understood ventilation. And when we think about ventilation, it is to maintain litter condition. And again, if you lose control of the moisture in the litter in a broiler house, we know what happens. Disease challenge goes up, foot pad lesions go up, which affects everything in broilers. Well, breeders are no different. If we lose control of that scratch area, for example, in bottlefoot, which it seems to be overrepresented in the males, they get lame because of a foot pad dermatitis and subsequent infection that comes after that skin being compromised. So yes, ventilation is kind of at the forefront now of breeder house management. And I would have never thought about that 15 or 20 years ago. So good litter quality, dry litter, equates to healthy feet in both the males and the females and a lower overall microbial challenge. We want that slat area to be in good shape. We want it to encourage proper animal husbandry and good behavior so that they do breed.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's critical, as you say earlier. If they can't act like a chicken, they're
That's right.
not going to get the job done. So thinking about what maybe is arguably the most important piece of the puzzle, I'm guessing, I'm just going to go on a limb here and think that nutrition plays a pretty important role in this whole reproductive equation, looking at everything that goes into the diet of these birds. Where should we be looking for opportunities to support fertility that'll deliver more healthier chicks?
Well, like you said, nutrition is paramount in any animal husbandry program, no matter what the species is. In chickens specifically, using a high quality organic mineral like Mintrex can help improve fertility by positively impacting the bird's immune system, skin integrity, shell quality, and semen quality. I've noticed in the past several years, there's a big movement toward using automatic egg collection systems in breeder farms. You see some of these big 3, 4, maybe even 6 house breeder complexes now that have a belt, essentially conveyor equipment connecting them all. So eggshell quality is more important than ever before, because you hear while you're experiencing those eggs being collected on those belts, that telltale tick tick sound of eggs gently bopping together. And when you do that, you get micro cracks. And we know micro cracks allow for bacterial invasion of the developing embryo of the egg. So I think adopting new technology brings up other problems that we have to solve through other methods, such as nutrition and improving shell quality. And that's just an observation from the old days of hand collection. There's not a whole lot that can go wrong with that when a person's doing it by hand. But as the industry has grown, as operations have grown, as the need for protein has grown, we've had as an industry to look at newer technologies to be able to keep up with the demand. And egg collection systems are one of those technologies that have to be managed correctly.
Well, back to the importance of managing all of the different pieces of this puzzle, the technology, the facility, the ventilation, the nutrition, it's all got to work in concert. And so let's kind of summarize this a minute. I want to get into research in a moment, but thinking about the management of the birds and the facilities and the overall program, if you will, since there's not necessarily a silver bullet, here's how we solve hatchability. What are you telling customers? We want to break this all down into some maybe practical tips or application steps that they can do with their flock to help improve their hatch numbers. How would you summarize those tips and recommendations?
Well, some of the best advice I've gotten in my life on anything, whether in life, whether it was involved in sports in a young age or in my college or educational experience, if you focus, and this is going to sound too simplistic, but as coming from an old hatchery man, I know this works. If you focus on the basics, you begin with the basics. So many times we start looking for a magic bullet that solves things, and we start getting away from basic animal husbandry practices. And sometimes we kind of lose our way. So my advice is to focus on the basics to begin with. I know it sounds simple, but we lose focus of the basics sometimes. Sound nutrition using high quality ingredients. I'm not a nutritionist, but I know what a good eggshell should look like. And to produce a good eggshell, we got to have good stuff going into the hen. Roosters that have the correct conformation, the correct CVs. We want to make sure that they're healthy, able to mate, producing semen that will fertilize the eggs. So again, nutrition. Secondly, adhering to a rigid, proven biosecurity program. That gets the industry in trouble more times than we know. It's easy for us as an industry to get complacent. I've been in production before, and when things are going good, we don't think about it as much as when we do have strong disease challenges. It's very, very hard to recover from a hard disease challenge. Again, I think monitoring litter conditions and adjusting ventilation in a broiler breeder house is part of animal husbandry, and it's very important. Like I say, 10, 12 years ago, no one ever thought about this, but now we need to ventilate for litter quality. Another thing that I see one extreme to the other on is having a good hatchery QA program. I didn't come up with this term, but I've used it for years. If you don't measure it, you can't manage it. If we don't know why that egg isn't hatching, is it early dead? Is it infertile? Is it incubation failure? We've got to be able to break out eggs in a hatchery. We've got to communicate that information back to the breeder program or breeder manager. And lastly, I was thinking about this the other day as I'm driving down the road and I meet a Model T on the road. And that car is over 100 years old, but it's functioning as it was designed. Maintenance, 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 whether it's in a breeder farm or in a hatchery, especially. If we maintain that equipment according to the way that equipment was originally designed, we'll get better results out of it, and that can increase hatch and when it obviously improve chick quality. So I know that's a simplistic view, but that is my observations of old guy that's been in the industry for about 38 years now.
Well, with that in mind, there's just a really wealth of great experience and practical tips. You were giving a customer one or two non-negotiables in there. I know you mentioned litter quality and ventilation a few times, but if there are things where you'd say, gosh, I could walk into 5 or 6 barns out of every 10 and see things that we're not doing well or could be improved on. If there were one or two like non-negotiables you would give to somebody managing a breeder flock at a high level, where could they make the biggest difference in improving in this area?
The quality of the ingredients going into the breeder feed that's not an area where you want to skimp. We don't want to feed them things where we're trying to save thousandths or hundredths of a cent per dozen eggs and then costing us a nickel per dozen eggs. Sorting is another thing. Recently, I've observed this where they're sorting birds, and there's some technology out there that I think it comes from Europe that makes this a lot better, to where you can sort pullets and put an emphasis on bringing some immature ones kind of up to standard a little bit more. That's a very intriguing idea. I think that may make a huge, huge impact on the industry, the ability to effectively sort and basic husbandry, basic management. Let's do things the right way. If we do things the right way consistently, we will get consistent, good results. If we do things mediocre consistently, we know we're going to get mediocre results.
Garbage in, garbage out, right? I'm glad you mentioned you talking about some of those new technologies there coming out of Europe. I was going to ask you about that. Speaking to a group of scientists and researchers, I always like to look and say, what's the research bringing us? Is there any promising research directions, new technologies, things that you're seeing or hearing that have you excited about the potential to improve breeder fertility and hatchability in the coming years?
I don't follow that or haven't followed that as closely as I should, I guess. There are some technologies that I think I would call them at the startup level now, that are very intriguing. Some things that involve using some prebiotics to displace certain bacteria. That, to me, there's a huge food safety potential impact there. One of the more interesting things to me that's come up lately has been the use of AI in sorting chicks, male versus female. And I know there are a couple of companies out there, and that is amazing stuff to see in use. I think there's 2 or 3 companies that have this technology now. And I think some U.S. companies are readily adopting it to where they can basically feather sex a bird very rapidly and very accurately. And, coming from my background of when I was first a hatchery manager, hand vaccinating each baby chick, and then when we did do a gender identification, it was having to take that bird and look at the wing feathers very closely. It was a very labor-intensive process. So that technology, to me, has the ability maybe to change the industry in a good way.
Yeah, I'm tickled that you mentioned it because it made me chuckle thinking about that we're talking about fertility, and you mentioned AI. And as a kid that grew up breeding beef cattle, I've been laughing. I'm like, AI in my world means something different than it does in the modern technological area. So here we have AI and AI coming to meet one another in conversation. Isn't that fun?
Very good point. Yes. In the turkey people, AI certainly means something completely different. So, yeah. And when I was reading some articles this morning about how the AI technology is going to hopefully improve a lot of things, I don't know. Seems like there's some good potential there.
I think you could be right. Doug Ward, what a great conversation. And as I said earlier, I would encourage people to go back and listen to the previous episode on this topic that we hosted with your colleague at Novus, Dr. Mercedes Vasquez Anon. Doug Ward, who is Poultry Senior Sales Manager at Novus International. And I want to give an extra word of thanks to Novus, our sustaining sponsor of the Poultry Science Association. Novus helps make a lot of what we do at PSA possible, especially at our international scientific conferences like the PSA annual meeting and North American Scientific Conference held in July. And coming up actually in just a little over 2 weeks, our inaugural PSA Pacific Rim Scientific Conference in Macau, China. Novus will be putting on one of the symposia at this year's conference in Macau. You can find out more details. Still time to register. You've got just a little about 2.5 weeks till we meet in Macau. Check out the scientific program at poultryscience.org. Thanks for joining us for another great episode of Unplucked, the official podcast of the Poultry Science Association. This episode was produced by Lindsay Johnston with editing and engineering by Michael Lunt of Parasol. You can subscribe and rate wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. Join us each week. We'll have something interesting, informative, and maybe if you're lucky, a little entertaining as well. For the Poultry Science Association, I'm Andy Vance. See you next week.